Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 16, where we see the movement from death to life. We begin with the superscription, a miktam of David. The term miktam, and as usual, our translators just took the Hebrew word and just changed it to English letters. It's the same Hebrew word. Comes from the root word katam, is the word for gold, and so I like to think of a miktam as a nugget, a little treasure. I think it was Spurgeon who wrote a whole collection of psalms and referred to them as the treasuries of David. And that's perhaps the idea here. That then is the superscription. Now we get into the psalm, and it starts off with the word shamani, preserve me, from the Hebrew word shamar, which is just to guard. I guess preserve works, to guard, to watch, but watch in the sense of protecting. I remember there was a city by the name of Shamaria, or we say Samaria, like a guardian city, sort of guarded the main road going north and south. So preserve me, O God, for I take refuge in you. And this is David's proclamation of faith. He says, "I'm going to take refuge in you, so you be sure to protect me." And then he continues, verse 2, "I said to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good besides you." That's a way of saying, you are my best good. Everything else just sort of pales to insignificance compared to you. Do you find that having certain things, doing certain things, after a while they lose their luster, they lose their shine, their ability to motivate. Um, but but not the Lord. He is our best good. He is our really our only good. Verse 3, as for the saints, and what he's going to do here is contrast the saints. He's going to contrast, there's going to be a contrast here between faith versus unbelief. You see, how can we tell our best good is in God? How can we tell we have taken refuge in him? Look at how we respond to others and the different sorts of others. So, as for the saints who are in the earth, that is the saints, they are the majestic ones in whom is all my delight. He loves being around God's people. But verse 4 is the contrast. The sorrows of those, and the those here refer to not the saints, but some other people. The sorrows of those who have bartered for another God. That's the tip off. And notice the word God there is italicized. That's not actually in the text, but the idea is going to be there as I see the context. So I think that's correct. The sorrows of those who have bartered for another, that is, besides the one that I'm following, um, they will be multiplied. I will not pour out their drink offerings of blood, nor will I take their names upon my lips. So he delights in God's people. He doesn't delight in the false worship practices of other people, people who turn away from the Lord. Verse 5, the Lord is the portion of my inheritance and cup. Now, notice God is going to be seen as his inheritance. It's the thing that he's waited for and wished for. He's really waiting to inherit the Lord. So the Lord is the portion of my inheritance and my cup. Um, you support my lot. That's another inheritance term. The lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Indeed, my heritage is beautiful to me. I will bless the Lord who has counseled me. Indeed, my mind instructs me in the night. Notice the counseling and the instruction. Those two ways of saying the same thing. And so, God as inheritance is what has taught him, has, notice, um, instructs him in the night. Sometimes you're busy throughout the daytime, and then you come to the night hours, and you're waiting, and sleep won't quite come, and you're wondering, and maybe even doubting. But that's when he receives the counsel of the Lord. That's when he receives the instruction of the Lord. That's when he sees that God is his inheritance, the one that he wants and the one that he possesses. Now, verses 8 through 11 are set up in sort of a chiasm. That's why I put it in a chart like this. Notice verse 8, I have set the Lord continually before me. because he is at my right hand. And notice the term right hand. That's going to be seen again. This is what makes this a parallel. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Look down to the end of verse 11. In your right hand, there are pleasures forever. So we're going to see some repetition, not always the same word, but the same idea. You get to verse 9, therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. And notice the rejoicing that takes place when we get down to the first part of verse 11. Or last part of first part of verse 11. In your presence is fullness of joy. So joy and rejoicing are going to be connected. He continues, my flesh will also dwell securely. And again, in first part of verse 11, you make known to me the path of life. It's interesting when we get to the Septuagint, you're actually going to translate it with the same word. We'll see that in just a bit. And then the central focus, we're going to read through all of this again. The central focus, though, the pivotal point in this section is going to be in verse 10. Notice that's in the middle. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, that is the place of the grave, the place of the death. Sheol is just another word for grave, but sometimes it has an idea then of more than just a hole in the ground. So you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. That's what happens in the grave. Put the body in the grave, and after a while, it begins to just fall apart, and bad things happen to it. And that's what death looks like. So he takes us in this journey, really to the brink of death, and who knows, maybe beyond. We're going to look at that, but then brings us back on the place of security and the path of life and joy. And notice we began. I have set the Lord continually before me. That continual idea, and we're going to end in your right hand. There are pleasures continually forever. See how we begin and end on the same note. Now, with that in mind, let's look individually at these verses. So we come to verse 8. I have set the Lord continually before me. The way you say before me in Hebrew, you say before my face. It's a figure of speech. So the word face is always in there. Because he is at my right hand. So, God is with me, before me, before my face, at my right hand. He's with me. And notice that David is trusting that the Lord is with him, because he says, I set him there. I have not let the Lord go out of my mind. I just didn't, put him on a shelf, and not that you can put God on a shelf, but mentally, you know what I'm saying? Sometimes yes, I believe that God is there, but I haven't thought of him in days and weeks and months and years. No, that's not David. He says, I set the Lord continually before my face, in front of me. He's at my right hand, and therefore, I won't be shaken. Even though bad things happen, they will not shake me. And so God is seen here as his security. Um, he continues, I will not be shaken. Therefore, my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. Notice how he says, last part of verse 9, my flesh will also dwell securely. Now, notice what he said, my flesh will dwell securely. Sometimes your flesh has a way of doing its own thing. I'm an old guy, and let me think what the date was, about 15 years ago, I suffered a heart attack. Not quite that long ago, but I saw a number of years ago, I suffered a heart attack, and my my spirit was willing, but my flesh just didn't want to come along, and it was a difficult time. And I came through, and the Lord delivered me from that, and I'm still around. My flesh is, can I use the term here? My flesh is dwelling securely. Of course, I've had some help with the doctors and things like that, and that's good. We go to verse 10, for you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. And we already said that's the realm of the dead. Now, technically, the term Sheol just means the grave, and it's used that way. They would bury the body. They did not, in biblical times, at least the Jewish people, did not burn the body. That was considered sort of gross to them. They would bury it, either dig a hole in the ground or sometimes find a cave and seal it up. Um, but either one of those was described as a Sheol. But then the term Sheol also had this idea of just where the dead reside. That was not something heavily developed in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we talk about heaven and God's presence. In the Old Testament, we don't have that many clear references to it. And so David here is saying, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol." You know, you protecting my body. And notice he goes from body to soul. You will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to undergo decay. That's parallelism. It's two different ways of describing the same thing. He continues, verse 11, "You will make known to me the path of life." And notice the sort of resurrection theme. You will make known to me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. In your right hand there are pleasures forever. So he looks to not be abandoned to the place of death, but instead to have the path of life, and that there would be at the right hand of God pleasures forever. Now, as we look at this psalm, David seems to be describing his own experiences, what he's going through, even when to borrow the language of another psalm, even when he goes through the valley of the shadow of death, even when things really look bad, he's trusting in the Lord to deliver him. And yet, in his words, I think there are the echoes of the experiences of another. You see, I think David's really writing this about himself, but as he describes his experiences, as he describes his trust in the Lord, I think he says more than he realizes. And the reason I say that is because of the way the New Testament has taken and applied these verses. So we're going to look at Acts chapter 2. This is actually the sermon that Peter is given. He's giving on the day of Pentecost, and the Holy Spirit had showed up, and Peter stands up and he explains what's going on to all the people that have gathered. There's a huge group of people that have gathered to find out what's going on. God is doing some weird things, strange things with fire and tongues, and Peter begins to speak about Jesus. And then he says about Jesus, he says, "For David says of him," and then he quotes the psalm that we've been looking. "I saw the Lord always in my presence, for he is at my right hand, so that I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart was glad and my tongue exulted. Moreover, my flesh will also live in hope." And notice I've circled the word live because, um, and he's quoting from Psalm 16 that we just read. And he goes on and he continues to quote, "Because you will not abandon my soul to Hades, nor allow your Holy One to undergo decay." Now he quotes that passage, and we saw David was really speaking about himself, and yet in some ways David's words really didn't apply. He continues, "You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of gladness with your presence." We saw that psalm, but now Peter goes on to comment on it. Verse 29, "Brethren, I may confidently say to you regarding the patriarch David, that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day." You say, wait a minute. David said, you won't abandon my soul in Sheol. You won't allow your Holy One to undergo corruption. You'll make known to me the ways of life. And Peter says, wait a minute. If that's true, there's David's grave over there. He died. He's still in it. There's nothing but bones there anymore. He has long since rotted away. He continued, "And so because he," that is David, "was a prophet and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants upon his throne." Now that was in Psalm 16. That was in another psalm, and also over in First Samuel, 2 Samuel, I'm sorry, where God had made a covenant with David, and because God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants upon his throne, he looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ. Now, when you say the word Christ, remember that's the Hebrew word Messiah. We have it here in Greek because the book of Acts was written in Greek. So the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. You see, this Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. And Peter is pointing out the words of David. I'm not entirely sure David realized that as he wrote the words, at least for the first time. I can't help but think maybe after he wrote them, he looked back and he said, "What did I just write? Wow!" And maybe he did begin to see that. But David was speaking as a prophet, and as a prophet, sometimes the prophets would prophesy and not realize the full extent of what it was they were prophesying. They it wasn't just meaningless words, but sometimes they said more than they realized they had said, and that seems to be the case with David, that he spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, where sure enough, Jesus died, was buried, and yet he was not abandoned to the place of the dead, nor did his flesh suffer decay. The skin didn't all eventually decay and fall off the bones, and no, but instead, God raised him up. And notice Peter finishes up, to which we're witnesses. We saw him. This is just not hypothetical theory. And because he rose, then we can take these words of this psalm not only as applying to David in the figurative sense, not only applying to Jesus in the literal sense, but we will experience that as well. Because he rose, there's coming a day when we will rise. And even when we go to the grave, we will not be abandoned, because he will raise us up again as well. If you're one of his people, if you have trusted in him as your Lord, as your Savior.